Okay, welcome back, everybody. I'm very much looking forward to this panel because we have two of the people who were sort of original conceivers of this whole concept, really. And when I was first asked by the World Economic Forum to chair a working group on new models, multi-stakeholder models of global problem-solving, cooperation, and governance, I went to Ngaire Woods, who's been a long time Davos and WEF partner and participant, and now is our host today. And also Rick Samans. I think actually the first conversation I had with Rick was many years ago, because I know he's quoted in Macroeconomics, which was published 4 years ago, about these topics. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. Why don't we start with Bretton Woods? Just wind back here for a second. And Ngaire, I know that you've been thinking about this. You're doing a BBC documentary on the anniversary of Bretton Woods and sort of where we're at today. Could we just flash back to that period? What was going on in the world, and what did Bretton Woods actually signify?
Right. So I'm just thinking of how this links as a segue from the last session, and maybe it doesn't entirely, but I think it does have something important at the end to say. So I won't give you a history lecture on the founding of the Fund and Bank, but just to say that the essence of it was that coming out of the Great Depression of the 1930s, in the crucible of the Second World War, it was absolutely clear to governments that they needed to bind themselves together in a set of rules to prevent catastrophe happening again. That's the economic catastrophe, which was a precondition for the war. In other words, faced with an economic crisis, a government's first instinct is to raise trade barriers and to devalue their currency. And in so doing, if they were the only country in the world that did that, of course they would grow and it would succeed. But if all other countries do it, it drives the whole world down into a quick recession. And that's what we saw after the 2008 financial crisis. We saw governments coming together again in order to prevent that by basically agreeing rules amongst each other. And that's quite simply what the Fund and Bank do. The Fund gives a set of rules where governments bind themselves not to devalue competitively, but to agree to hold their exchange rates fixed, and when they want to change their exchange rates, to do it in consultation with other governments, and to commit to help other governments in crisis, to lend money to governments in crisis, so that those governments won't take measures which destroy the prosperity of neighboring countries. And the World Bank, it was clear at the end of the war that you needed to reconstruct the countries that had been involved in the war. It was equally clear that the markets wouldn't do that on their own. And so you needed an intergovernmental organization to facilitate and accelerate the process of pumping money into countries that had been devastated by war. Now, where I think the role of the Fund and Bank are interesting is that they highlight for us that there are some things, and they continue today, which governments have to do, and for which we need intergovernmental cooperation. And it feels to me, listening to the debate this morning, as though there are two slightly different philosophies in this room that are not on the same page. One is a philosophy that says that global solutions networks and these multi-stakeholder networks are an alternative to government. They're an alternative to international institutions. It's a sort of apolitical view in a way, because it's suggesting that these multi-stakeholder networks are self-equilibrating. They're going to have self-restraint. And on the other hand, there's a more political view, which says we've got institutions, we've got governments, we've got intergovernmental organizations, and whether we like it or not, there are powerful interests that push them. And so if we disagree with the powerful interests that are pushing them, we need to form social movements that countervail. So we need strong, effective social movements around the world to influence, not to supplant or as an alternative, but to influence and to countervail the political forces that are already at play in governments and in intergovernmental organizations. And if you understand that there are those two views, I think there are some notes of caution that we need to follow from that. So the first note, which came out in this morning's discussion about what issues you pick, my first point would be to say, don't be complacent. Don't have a sort of complacency about the existence of government in the first place. In other words, to treat networks as the kind of indulgence of people who live in countries which actually have governments, even though you might not like them. Let's not forget that the whole NGO movement transnationally came out of NGOs organizing against very powerful governments in South Asia and in Asia in general, because they were fighting against really strong, powerful, repressive governments. What went wrong, in my view, with some of the NGO movement and the transnational movements was when they took those same campaigns to the continent of Africa in the late 1980s and 90s, to places where there was no effective government, and argued that they should be, and argued for a place not in strengthening and improving government, but rather in offering an alternative funding route for government. So you had donors funding NGOs instead of funding governments. You created an environment in which it made it very, very difficult for government to flourish. So the first sort of point I wanted to add to this conversation is, let's not take governments for granted. Let's be much clearer about what it is that social movements do and what it is that governments do and what intergovernmental cooperation is for. And there is a reason why, once you clarify that, there is a reason why governments have structured representation. So when we talk about multi-stakeholder networks, and we say everybody's invited, this is inclusive, this is this is inclusive and participatory. What does that mean? If you are going to get married, okay, just each of you think about your decision perhaps to marry somebody else. Which stakeholders should be involved in that decision, in your view? And how should they be involved? Should it be their decision because they're going to be affected by the fact that you're getting married? Or should it be your decision? Like, think about what participation actually means. We throw around participation as though it's a neutral term and as though everybody comes to participation with an equal voice when clearly they don't. So the danger of multi-stakeholder networks is that they become open fora in which the best resourced, the loudest, and those with the highest incentives to win actually end up prevailing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have multi-stakeholder networks. It means we need to be clear about where and how they are most effective. So my shot, and I'll stop there as an introductory remark, but my shot is this. It's that you need to think about the process of governance as a dynamic. At one end of the spectrum, you've got agenda setting, and perhaps even negotiations of standards. And that's where we see transnational social movements at their best. They're active, they're actively engaged, you get a loud public debate where lots of voices get represented. You get CEOs of companies standing up and saying, yes, we want to supply essential medicines to some of the poorest parts of the world. Okay, that's phase one. Now you move to phase two, implementation. The CEO is often no longer involved, and I think Mark Spellman hinted at this yesterday. The CEO is not involved in implementation. The decision has gone down into the company, into profit-making centers held to account for their profits. And what became a desire to provide essential medicines becomes a desire to dump toxic breast implants into countries that are poor and are then going to have to face the costly business of disposing of them appropriately. So you can go quite quickly from a great intention to an implementation which is egregious, or from a set of high aspirations to an implementation process which more and more as it goes into detail, reflects the most powerful vested interests in the sector. You can start with a vision to provide cheap ARVs to HIV/AIDS victims all around the world. You can very quickly, through the detail, end up with a fund which is basically a commodity fund, which permits pharmaceutical companies to keep selling the ARVs at their full price instead of at a reduced price, because there's now a fund that's going to pay them. So all I'm pointing to is that the process is a dynamic one. Social movements are really effective at the agenda setting, but at some point along that line, there is a reason why you need to engage intergovernmental processes. There's a reason why you want structured representation so that you're not left with vested interests, and rule-bound decision-making so that people actually have to take responsibility for the decision that's made and be accountable through a political process for the decision that's made. And finally, that's why international organizations are so slow, so frustrating, and so difficult, because they're actually making laws. And you wouldn't want your government to go and overnight change the legal parameters within which your society works. You would want that to be a long and contested and drawn out process, which is bound by rules and is structured by representation. Because otherwise, you would simply be being rolled over by the most powerful in the system. So that's the reason why we have these structured, difficult, slow, ponderous international organizations. But there's a very good reason why we need them, and why the social movements that are becoming more vibrant and more powerful have an incredibly important role to play in pushing innovation and renovation of them. But in my view, have no role to play in supplanting them, because they simply can't. You can't have a multi-stakeholder network which is pooling resources to offer governments credit in a time of crisis.
Okay, well, that's we're right into it here. So, Rick, I was going to ask you a bunch of polite questions about the web and what you're doing. I'm dying to leap into this conversation. Pardon?
Let's do it.
Well, let me just start by saying that, and I'll throw it over to you, Rick, but I think in the past, we've had this view that there are formal representative institutions and there are social movements that influence them. Mm-hmm. But it turns out that advocacy is only one of 10 types of multi-stakeholder networks. Mm-hmm. And in many situations, a multi-stakeholder network can solve a problem or even achieve governance in ways that traditional representative institutions cannot. And that's kind of what we're exploring. But anyway, Rick, over to you. Why don't you just react? And we got representation, we got legitimacy, we got accountability, we got all kinds of big issues on the table.
I feel happily seated in between the two of you, because my views sort of conflate the two, if you will. But
the blue line.
First, let me just say what a pleasure it is to be on your turf, and on your turf in a way as well. I haven't really had this opportunity before, so it's really nice to be in your lair, so to speak, on these issues. Now, you triggered this train of thought by asking about Bretton Woods. Just a footnote here, and we think of Bretton Woods as the crucible of some big formal intergovernmental institutions, and of course it was. However, if you go into the history of what produced this, the discussion, dialogue, and thought process, it basically was a multi-stakeholder set of people appointed by their governments. And I'm talking here about academics, I'm talking about industrialists. Yes, they were deployed and dispatched, and in some cases even employed by governments, but the people who were in Dumbarton Oaks and then in New Hampshire was a multi stakeholder set of experts and actors who, and then so in that respect, there is a bit of a parallel to your GSN thing. But then let me extend that thought a little bit, and this is how I back into this a bit of a debate, sort of very polite below the surface debate that you guys are trying to have to liven up our morning here.
Sorry, was I polite and under the surface?
I think about this topic as from a results-oriented, problem-solving perspective, as opposed to from a process perspective. I think, and I don't mean to denigrate the academic focus on process and typology and all that. I think it's incredibly useful what you all are doing in this regard. But basically, Bretton Woods, those institutions were formed to try to make progress on or solve, if you want to use that term, on a couple specific problems. One was monetary disorder from the experience of having fixed and linked and anchored exchange rates, which then linked everybody's monetary policy. And then people started trying to game the system in a bigger thy neighbor sort of way. And that contributed to all sorts of economic and political discord, if you will. And so that was one problem that they were trying to solve. And the solution was a better set of formal arrangements among governments, because governments are the ones who issue currency and who manage monetary policy. So that was, the solution was a formal intergovernmental one to a problem that was sort of intrinsically a formal intergovernmental one. Then on the World Bank side, basically the problem was reconstruction, particularly in Europe. And this was about basically, reconstituting infrastructure and industry. And this was basically perceived as the only way to get this moving at scale was, again, an intergovernmental effort, mobilizing lots of public funds, if you will, but then tapping the markets through the structure of the bank. But essentially it required an intergovernmental, and particularly US commitment of official resources for a problem that needed, at least at the outset, an official sector kickstart. Okay? Now, the current, if you look at your GSN research and you look at the types of problems that these networks predominantly are addressing, they are addressing a set of problems that are byproducts of, if I can use that term, of what everybody has referred to, I'm sure, several times already here, which is globalization in its various facets, the rise of the private sector, activity, technology, deregulation on the governmental side, et cetera. And that, in this world where you've had a lot of improvement in living standards, but still a lot of poverty, a lot of disparity, you have public goods that are not being provided for, the tragedy of the commons issues that have arisen as a result of all this expanded industrial activity, you're in a realm with a set of problems that are intrinsically no longer as intergovernmental in their nature, and therefore no longer, in my view, structurally, solely require or principally require an intergovernmental response. Because why? The intergovernmental community is hampered in responding to these types of issues, health issues, humanitarian issues, environmental issues, of externalities of all sorts, not because there's some philosophical problem with government and whatnot. From my perspective, again, taking it from a results-oriented, problem-oriented perspective, scale, much of the resources, certainly capital, is outside of the pockets, if you will, the coffers of government. Secondly, efficiency. There are very large transaction costs in having a multilateral process. And as Ngaire was saying, in some cases you want those transaction costs because there's a way to protect the legitimacy of what is a norm-setting process. But look at most of the issues that we're dealing with what you guys call GSNs. They are not principally norm-setting processes. Some are, there's no question about it, but a lot of them are about building a better mousetrap to mobilize and deploy resources, or linking in much wider sources of expertise, or raising consciousness, or a whole variety of things that are not norm-setting things where you need to come up with a formal instrument, be it a norm, a law, international law, or a fixed formal institution. And then thirdly, besides scale and efficiency issues, there are coherence issues. The world now has become politically much more a diverse landscape, and these problems often are linked. When you're dealing with economic, social, and environmental issues, they overlap in many, many dimensions, which I don't need to belabor. My point here is in saying that the formal intergovernmental processes, by and large, are specialized into specific areas. And I don't mean to level that as a particular crack at the intergovernmental world, because look at academia. Look at trade associations in the business world. Humanity tends to sort of specialize deeply, which is one of the reasons why sitting here in a school like this is a great one, because you're as far as I can tell, you're a pretty interdisciplinary type of approach to teaching, which I strongly believe in. But the point is that here again, the formal intergovernmental machinery is not particularly well matched to this new set of problems, if you will. And so that's how I look at this issue. So that's why I can agree with Ngaire in saying, don't view this as this body of activity as a substitute for governments. In fact, to me, I think of it as a way to extend the reach of what formally constituted democratic decision-making processes are trying to do. And this is why I try to, we get into some of the specifics later. This is how I try to reassure those parts of the international community that have trepidation about some of this stuff. It started with the NGO community 10 years ago, which was deeply suspicious of the private sector's engagement in what you guys call GSNs. But if you talk to some of the people in the formal, intergovernmental world, including in developing countries, they've been on a journey too of understanding that this extends the reach of our resources and our expertise to be able to solve problems. And so that you can't, it's important to not look at this in a black and white cartoon way, even from that kind of perspective, because there simply aren't enough resources at official disposal to make a huge dent in poverty, to, as was referenced earlier, to improve the prospects for serious transformation of energy systems, et cetera, et cetera. So let me stop there as a way to try to agree with both of you and reframe the discussion.
Okay, well, Ngaire, let's come back to you. But before we do that, let's make sure we are having the right debate. Is there anyone in this room who thinks we shouldn't have governments or international organizations? I don't think so. I mean, that's not on the table. The question is, where are the opportunities whereby a multi-stakeholder approach could not only influence these organizations, but could create value in and of themselves in a way that helps us solve problems, and in some cases, even governs resources. Like you and I were talking yesterday about the ecosystem that governs the internet. Governments are involved, but they don't control it. They, on their own volition, decide to adopt standards, assign resources to that ecosystem, but it's a pure meritocracy and it's a pure volunteer thing, and it's truly a multi-stakeholder thing, and it works. I mean, the internet works. So as they say, we don't believe in kings or hierarchies, we believe in rough consensus and running code. And that's sort of the mantra. So back to you.
So on the ecosystem governing the internet, I think you mentioned yesterday that the challenge to that system is now coming from Russia and China, precisely because they want to exercise more control. So what I would say is that if and as that challenge strengthens, you will necessarily find that the governance of the internet gets pushed into a more formalized intergovernmental rulemaking system, because that is the system that Russia and China, that's the only system in the end they're going to trust if there's a quid pro quo involved. So it's the complementarity. I very much agree with what Rick is saying, and my message is not that the intergovernmental system solves all problems. It's to say that I think in these projects and in this overall project, we need very clearly to distinguish what the role of the networks are and what the role of intergovernmental organizations is. And to me, the role of intergovernmental organizations, and in a way that the lessons are two-way, Don. So when I say intergovernmental cooperation is difficult, one should really only be resorting to it where there is a collective action problem which governments need to solve. It has consequences for the UN, right? So there's part of me that thinks, no, the UN should not become a multi-stakeholder dialogue or a multi-stakeholder network. That's making it into something that it doesn't need to be, because there are so many much more agile multi-stakeholder networks outside of it. Why would you turn the UN into that? If the UN itself is morphing into that, then it's losing its way, because what the United Nations agencies are these very precious intergovernmental organizations trusted because governments know they're represented in them. So when UNAIDS says to a country, no, you actually have to treat your sex workers for HIV/AIDS because otherwise you are not going to solve your problem, which is something that many governments do not want to hear and is politically extremely difficult for them to implement. That's an important message because it's coming from the UN and there's no other agency it could come from. So to me, there is a precious and important role that the intergovernmental organizations are playing. But we really need to think about what that role is and not start trying to load them up with being something that's different to that, because then they will surely fail. They'll become these kind of multi-purpose do-nothing organizations, which I think some are at great risk of becoming. On the multi-stakeholder networks, I do think the issue of accountability is a really important one. And I think transparency is really important. And it is very, very lacking in current multi-stakeholder networks and dialogues and partnerships. That they should hold themselves to the same transparency norms as they have pushed international organizations to have. Because otherwise, you don't know who is norm setting. You don't know whose solutions are actually being promulgated, where they've come from, who has ownership of them. So, number one, I think there has to be transparency. I'd love to hear whether Don and Rick agree with that. Transparency means publishing your board minutes. It means publishing your decisions. Most of all, it means publishing your full accounts. Who are you funded by and where is your funding going to? Really, really important. And the second thing is that where multi-stakeholder networks are becoming solution providers, deliverers, implementers, they need to be monitored and evaluated by other groups, by academics, by groups such as everybody in this room, again, to bring sunlight and transparency onto what they do, because they suffer, as every organization in the world does, from the creep that I was describing. You start with a great intention, but you quickly become bound up by your own incentives to survive as an organization, to get more membership fees paid, to get some media attention, to plant your flag in the ground, to show that you're achieving, and those incentives can be distorting. So as an organization, to stay true to your mission, whether you're a social network, whether you're a social movement, you need that attention on you, even though it's intensely uncomfortable.
Did you want to react? Representation's a big one too.
Yeah, legitimacy is a fair issue.
Yeah.
But let me gently nudge back on this, because there's another form of legitimacy, which is results. And I think, again, from a problem-oriented, results-oriented way of looking at the world, a lot of intergovernmental activity suffers a crisis of legitimacy because it's a lot of motion, a lot of dust kicked up, and not much forward progress. And that is what is giving rise, fundamentally, to a large amount of the space we're talking about here. So I can totally agree with you. In some cases, I don't want to we shouldn't paint with too broad a brush here. When you're in a norm-setting process that has potential application broader than the scope of the partnership itself, what you would call the GSN itself, then clearly there's an obligation, I think, for some degree of transparency. So norm-setting things, either through direct effect or often they have indirect effect because they set a standard that then creates a lot of pressure, moral suasion on everybody else to adopt that standard. So I think it's totally appropriate what you're suggesting. But I also think that we need much better accountability for progress in the world, whether it is with respect to these coalition type arrangements or for these big sprawling multilateral exercises, okay? So maybe just one or two other points in this regard more widely. So to me, the fundamental issue here is that I think that there are a lot of problems out there that do not need a 195 nation agreement to make a lot of progress. And really the work, the polity, whether it's national, local, global, if there is one, is increasingly frustrated, I think, with an inability of the duly elected leadership to get our act together to be able to really make progress in some of these areas, or to make sufficient progress. And so there is a marketplace, so to speak, for coalitions of capable actors who are aligned to come together and decide, well, we only need about 15 key players to take a big bite out of this problem. and let's just do that. Yes, we should talk about it and let people know what our intention is and whatnot, but we shouldn't be deterred by thinking that governance needs to be all of the bells and whistles that you would expect from a national, democratic process or from an intergovernmental process. We can get a big chunk of the job done by doing this. And yes, we're going to wrestle with how we communicate this, who you create in the partnership. And I think having catalyzed a whole bunch of these animals of different sorts, to me, and I just had this discussion last night actually on one of the issues that you guys are discussing here. This very question, as we were in the midst of forming a partnership, which I think will become much more known about in about a month. Part of it is the composition, who's in the partnership, and part of it, and this is my point in particular, because people were far too focused in this particular conversation on form. Part of it is, what is the purpose? What's the scope of activity that you're tackling? And that is at least as important as whether you've got all the right players or you've got the right interests involved in the thing. And so, in a multi-stakeholder governance world, you've got at least those two comments, which are crucial, and then you articulated in passing a third one, which is this notion of rough consensus. And that because it's not trying to set a multilateral norm, you're basically just trying to make big progress on a certain set of issues. What usually is the threshold is whether there is a preponderance of support within the partnership, a rough consensus on a standard. And then it's optional whether people want to opt in or not. And that if you have that degree of rough consensus, and there is no mechanical formula that can tell you in all cases what that is, it depends on the issue and whatnot. And you've got a critical mass of the right actors involved with the right expertise and a critical mass of the real influence to bring progress to bear on the issue. And you've got the right framing of the activity, so you're not basically trying to usurp some other role that some other organization is legitimately playing in this space. Through the combination of those three things, you can usually, in a rough justice sort of way, arrive at a framework which can stand the test of scrutiny and public opinion. It's not, you probably should report on it as well and be transparent, but these are really the fundamental building blocks that you think about when you're trying to catalyze a big effort in one of these spaces. And often, at the last analysis, what it's trying to do is to improve the ability to implement what has already been set by official authorities as the goal. And the official processes often set direction, and then it's a question of, well, how do you get there? And are there several different ways and different architectures of how you make progress? And most of these partnerships are not trying to be the be it and end all of that. They're just basically trying to say, hey, we can crack through a big part of this if we come together.
But I wonder whether there's a risk that some of the new partnerships, because I share absolutely Rick's view that results are what really matters. I think there is a risk for some of the multi-stakeholder networks that they fall into the same trap as the United Nations agencies, which is to count success in terms of process. How many times have you had meetings with agencies where people say, oh no, but, and I can think of lots of NGOs for which this is true as well, where you sit down and you say, well, what's the success? Oh, it's fantastic. We've had 15 meetings, we've published 4 reports, we got mentioned in a General Assembly resolution, and you're like, but I thought your mission was to improve maternal health. So what on earth has all that got to do with the improvement of maternal health in this country in which you're operating? Like, what are the real results?
That seems to me more like a criticism of the traditional institutions than the network, which are focused purely and exist purely to deliver actual results, not bureaucratic
But that's my open question is there a risk that some of the multi-stakeholder networks will fall into that problem? It's an open question.
Yep.
And my other question just about the multi-stakeholder networks is to what extent they are giving a short-term burst of activity around something which will then need to be picked up by governments. So if you take the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS tuberculosis and malaria. This was a multi-stakeholder initiative which was founded on the idea that by giving foundations, affected victims, seats at the table, you would gradually increase the private sector's donations to the fund. That absolutely clearly hasn't happened. It's governments that have stepped up to the plate and governments that have ended up carrying the Global Fund and its funding model with a donation from the Gates Foundation alongside. But it has actually failed as a mechanism to get that the private sector has failed to contribute, whichever way you want to see it. But it is in the end something that government's carrying the can of. And I just wonder what we see in lots and lots of well-intentioned efforts, and then they're not for naught, but is a first 3 years of excitement and mobilization. Let's build the schools, let's build the hospital, and then who's going to carry all the liabilities along after that? That doesn't mean it's a waste of time. It just means you've got to think about what the sustainability of the model that you're pursuing is.
Anthony, did you want?
I've just been really keen to throw another challenge in there because I was struck by your opening remarks, Ngaire. I was thinking, on the one hand, I fundamentally don't disagree that it's true in multi-stakeholder networks, the best resource actors can win, the loudest and sometimes win. Accountability and transparency can be low. However, the representative process has its own problems too,
Sure.
right? Falling voter turnout, less than 50% of people vote, 20% elect the majority governments. You've got low transparency, you've got record levels of low trust in political institutions and politicians. So part of this, at the end of the day, becomes, well, who really represents the public interest, really? And I'm a firm believer in the democratic process. I think, unfortunately, the institutions aren't really living up to the potential right now. So that kind of problematizes this whole idea that somehow governments are a better institution for accountability and representation.
But does that mean the NRA better represents the American population, which it would claim to do, by the way, which it claims to do, than the elected governments who are only elected by about 30% of people, at state level?
No, but here,
I'm just throwing out a challenge.
No, but it's
you're not disagreeing, but I'm saying it's a problem that I think collectively we have to think about.
but also, I think that there's a growing view amongst a lot of citizens, especially young people, that governments don't represent me. And to use your NRA example, 92% of Americans want a law passed saying that there should be background checks for firearms. The government, the legitimate representative government for the people, by the people, of the people, is not able to pass a law. So there is a real emerging crisis of legitimacy that's shaping up in my mind. I just wanted to make a couple of comments too, that it's like networks of the willing and committed that can make a difference in something. And if there's one thing that I've been emphasizing, this is not about advocacy. Advocacy is one of the 10 types. But say in a crisis today, I was talking yesterday, my daughter lives in the East Village in New York. When Hurricane Sandy hit, you couldn't find the traditional representative institutions, but you put out some tweets to Crisis Commons, a multi-stakeholder, self-organizing network that doesn't represent anybody, and sandbags showed up. So for my daughter, that's creating real legitimate value. For some reason, the World Bank can't get a $70 pump to a farmer in Sub-Saharan Africa, so Kiva goes and raises hundreds of millions of dollars to actually deliver pumps. So I think one of the most important things we're trying to achieve here is that for people who care about a problem, that they can have a whole set of tools, if you like, to attack that problem. Stephen Lewis, did I tell this story yesterday? Can't remember. He cares a lot about rape, former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. He's working with a bunch of women. Normally you'd create an advocacy network that would say that governments in Asia or in India should prosecute, or that there should be better laws around rape in certain parts of the world and so on. But maybe there are other ways of attacking this problem. Maybe you should create a watchdog network that uses Google Maps to sort of create brings transparency to where sexual violence is occurring in the room. Maybe you should do what Stephen Lewis is doing, is to create a knowledge network, because he thinks the reason that the biggest thing that can be done to move the ball forward on this is to know why women don't self-report, which is different right down to the village level in many cases. And if we can find out why they don't report, then we can start to attack, sure, involving governments as appropriate, the material conditions that lead to this problem. So we've got diasporas now that are multi-stakeholder networks that are not just supporting the local soccer team, but are raising funds to solve problems in the world and are intervening to help, fix things in their ancestral land. So are they legitimate? Well, the World Economic Forum is a multi-stakeholder network. Nobody elects it. Does it have legitimacy? The way Klaus Schwab decides, says, you need to have clear goals. You need and make them clear. You need to measure yourself against those goals, show if you have efficacy. You need to make sure that the compensation of your managers doesn't violate integrity. And you need to be supported by your stakeholders. If they think that you're delivering value, then that's some value that is being created. I just wanted to say one other thing, and we could go on and on about this, but just around the issue of climate change, where states and traditional institutions haven't had a lot of progress. I mean, I'm from Canada, and Canada is called the dirty old man of climate change in a lot of these conversations. I'm also from Toronto, and we have a mayor who's called all kinds of things too. But to Anthony's point, I'm represented by a government that was chosen by 40% of those who voted, 60% of the electorate voted, so 24% of Canadians who could vote put this government in power. What percent of them would agree with the government's position, which is the only position of Canada and all of its citizens? Let's give them half. So we're now down to 12%. Then we got all the immigrants and the young people who can't vote. And this is missing all kinds of other perspectives, points of view. And the most important thing is it's missing an opportunity to orchestrate a whole bunch of capability that could start to solve problems. Companies taking action, civil society organizations, governments at all kinds of different levels. We're having a session this afternoon about cities. And one of the projects we're working on is what would a global parliament of cities look like, going beyond C40 to actually create some kind of parliament. Well, for sure, there are some issues it couldn't deal with, like war and conflict, although it might have an impact, that are really the purview of nation states. But there are probably a bunch of issues where cities could come together, and if not govern parts of the global economy, could certainly make a contribution. So my bottom line is that I think the world is becoming more complex, and the crisis is not a crisis of these new models, although there's not a lot is known about them. The real crisis is with our traditional institutions that are failing in many places. Sorry, that was kind of a long. Sure, you want to go ahead?
If I can go back, I think, so I agree with you, right? The general observation that there is declining trust in government and there is declining performance in government. We've observed the European elections last month, all these things. But I don't think so. Before Bruce made the point that governments and institutions aren't institutions per se. They're made up by individuals, right? And my question would be, how do GSN play a role in regenerating government? Because in this room we all agree that governments are necessary, and if they're failing, how can GSN help them deliver better, not only raising issues and be complementary to them, but also channel sort of human capital into government? How do GSN produce new politicians and a new intrapreneur rather than entrepreneur within government?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is kind of how I think about this. I'm not very comfortable in this legitimacy debate dichotomy, because I think it's a legitimate question, ensuring there's a degree of transparency about this stuff. But I think the main issue is along the lines that you're raising here, and maybe hit a couple examples of and answer your question. One is the related to what Ngaire said earlier about, well, ultimately, in order to get complete scale, don't you end up having to come back, beat a path back to the door of governments? And the answer in many cases is absolutely yes. But the role of GSNs is that in many cases, you can't start with a multilateral agreement on the standard. It's too difficult.
Correct.
And so what has been happening in a variety of spaces, and you've mapped some of them, and I just spent my hour train ride from London this morning about one of them in the climate space, is that there are coalitions of people, of actors coming together. I chair something called the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. It's 7 organizations, business, investor, and environmental organizations, backed up by the 5 largest accounting firms and the 2 main professional associations of accounting, that said enough is enough in terms of 1,000 flowers blooming of all sorts of different questions to companies and what they should report. Let's, we're going to get nowhere with that. The securities regulators are not moving. So let's band together, and in the best tradition of the way accounting standards were created for the financial community, nearly 100 years ago for mainstream financial reporting, let's get a best practice standard, if you will, set up of how companies should report in their mainstream filings, not just as a communication device in the side sustainability report. And let's just get a coalition prepared to do that, and then lead by example. And if that becomes established as what I like to say is going from best practice to common practice, then it becomes a heck of a lot easier for the regulatory authorities to sweep it in to rules, because effectively the market is already doing it, if you will. And that is exactly what happened in several aspects of financial accounting, as I say, decades ago. So this is one concrete example. There are some others where governments have picked up standards that have been created by plurilateral undertakings in that regard. The second way, and this we're involved in as well, is basically having a wider spectrum policy deliberative process. And so what I mean by that is on a given issue, where you need to have a more fundamental strategic think about what should be the main thrust, instead of, from a negotiator standpoint, you're in the short term. You've got to figure out what's going to happen in the next year or 2 cycle at best. And in some cases, and I would argue right now we're doing this on trade. We did it several years ago in partnership with the G20 when it was a finance minister and central bank process, was to say, hey, out of the lobbying context where you're talking to companies, out of the cycle of your negotiations and your normal intergovernmental process, let's have a wider conversation with leading academics, leading market participants, and the policymakers themselves about some of the basic issues. And then out of that comes a set of recommendations which the governments don't have responsibility for. But in many cases, that does 2 things. One is put some straw dog ideas out on the table, and it gets tested in the marketplace of ideas and in the political marketplace. And the second thing is it creates an informal space for people to talk face to face or to collaborate face to face and kick some ideas around and get to know each other's red lines and bottom lines much better. And that creates a better ecosystem for a more productive official decision-making process. That's another way. I think you call these things policy networks, if you will. Mm-hmm. And still a third way is I'll stop here because I could give you other example. Another typology you guys have is you call them operational and delivery networks. These are about basically PPPs or MSPs on the ground where basically you do need to extend the reach of official resources on a given issue. And so we have a few of these. The biggest one we've got going right now is Grow Africa, which is in 10 African countries, a partnership that G8 has asked us to spearhead, but that 3 governments, including the one governing this country, is providing support for. But what is it? It's not an ODA approach. It's an agricultural value chain build-out approach, where you get a layer of multinational companies that make retailing purchase commitments and investments, and then national companies, national and local companies, to identify agricultural commodity value chains that can be built out in African or other developing countries if you got the right mix of investment, purchase commitments, and the like. And that creates a more sustainable model of how you build out, how you create some food security and build out an agricultural economy in parts of the world that aren't really well connected otherwise. At the end of the day, though, coming back to Ngaire's point, we're not an agricultural development organization. We're basically a catalyst for putting together partnerships that help to solve policy issues or resource issues or competence building issues. In this case, we are in the process of trying to spin this off, as we've done in the past in various things. And it needs to be spun off for longer term sustainability and scalability into a public-private partnership but anchored in the region and in an official organization. So we're in discussion with a couple of candidates in that respect, to your point. But these are the ways. I mean, and the real issue isn't so much this legitimacy debate. It is, if you will, if you define the legitimacy as the way I did at the top, which is, how do you get stuff moving? If you weight that properly, it is, about improving legitimacy of the system. But the other questions that we're talking about here is structurally, how do these things relate? How do they produce synergy as opposed to basically undermining democratic processes and legitimacy? That's the real terrain that's interesting from my perspective to explore. Last word on this is that I call this landscape we're talking about about multidimensional cooperation, which includes multilateral cooperation, but extends far beyond it because it's operating at several different levels, not only stakeholder levels, but modality of engagement levels. And I don't want to take any further time to take that apart, but I think that's what this means for international cooperation, is that we're moving beyond multilateral to multidimensional in these two respects.
Did you want to react?
Yeah, I could. Well, I mean, I entirely agree with Rick's depiction of these as complementary processes. I still think there is a live debate in this room, which is not everybody on that same page, right? And the reason why I think that debate is quite important is because there is a vicious circle which takes you from governments lacking trust and legitimacy to governments yet further lacking trust and legitimacy. And it's that space that, as we can see across the world, takes you straight to a form of populism, which is government using fear, using ethnicity, using religion, using shortcuts to bring people together and to win support. And that's a dangerous territory. And it's when you get to there that you're reminded of why government is important as a way to take forward a collective aspiration which cuts across those different communities that exist in any country of the world. So I think it is quite important to think about whether these multi-stakeholder networks are strengthening and empowering and holding to account and pushing forward and innovating government, or whether they're setting themselves up to further delegitimate and weaken government, whether by design or not. And I say this, at Davos this year, I sat watching a panel of CEOs who spent an hour pouring disdain on government, how dreadful government is, how awful people who work in government are, and I said to them at the end of the panel, if your companies had each been described in these terms over a long period of time, how would that impact on the quality of people you could attract to come and work with you? How would it impact on the quality of work that you yourself would do for an organization so disdain? Now, obviously I say this, I'm the Dean of a School of Government. I aspire to seeing really smart, innovative, well-intentioned, highly motivated people making governments work better, who look for solutions from multi-stakeholder networks, who reach out to different stakeholders who have much better information, more nimbleness, more adaptiveness. But I think we can't simply ignore the politics behind this debate. We have to be aware that there is a politics behind this debate and think smartly about how it is that these projects abut the ways in which government around the world is going to evolve.
Yeah, at the back there, yeah.
I wonder if we can instantiate some of these ideas in a specific example. ICANN is leading a multi-stakeholder model now, how the internet governance might evolve in the future. And if each of you had to give 3 pieces of advice to the people involved in the ICANN and IGF process about how you balance off the government, the intergovernmental, and the networks, what would those 3 pieces of advice be?
You've written on.
Why don't we table that, and then we're going to have to wrap up in a minute, and we'll give everyone a chance to make some final remarks. That's a great question. Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree there's 2 important debates here, and it's like your point, Don, about who would agree in the room that we don't need governments. I mean, it's not, no one's saying we don't see a role for government, but I think the starting point is there is crisis is very strong emotive words, but in terms of institutions generally and government specifically, trust is down. It's a fact. Trust is racing to the bottom. So we're talking about the phenomenon of GSNs and their role, and yes, I think there is the question that the gentleman to my left asked is what role GSNs can and should play in strengthening the role or legitimacy of our institutions, and I think we're not addressing that. We're seeing there's something that's emerging that is that GSNs are a possible threat. There's a possible dark side scenario that governmental institutions are pushed further into disrepute. So the question still remains in my mind about how GSNs can strengthen the role of all existing institutions, which in an ideal world would be more efficient and effective than at solving big problems than perhaps they are. Question.
Actually, you've had one. Let's go over here. Yeah.
So I just wanted to very quickly address some of the points just raised. I think particularly around the role of GSNs in strengthening existing institutions. I work for C40, and as an organization that works, connects cities around the world to learn from each other, it is an organization that is a GSN very much targeted at strengthening existing institutions. So I guess I wanted to throw that out as an example and something we'll pick up more on in the afternoon, hopefully. But I think I also take all of the points you just raised around sort of GSNs needing to get better at accountability, leadership, transparency, and these points. But for me, I think the key, the big issue we need to get better at addressing, and we as an organization are trying to get better at this all the time, is measuring the results we're delivering on the ground because of the complexity of the issues that we're tackling. And I don't think this is just a GSN issue. I think even governments and traditional institutions face this. How can we better establish the relationship between cause and effect and measure the results we're delivering on the ground? So I think it's a big question for all of us, GSNs and traditional institutions.
Okay, very briefly, and then we'll wrap up.
I just want to follow up on Anthony's point on representation. I think it is a real issue that drives us to the other side of the coin. So far, we have got to see just one side of arguments that the politically diversified landscape in the world is effective for the MSN model. But I also think that it could be a risk to the MSN model because in the past, we've got traditional broadcast media that the only channel popular debates, but now with social media, which actually need a lot of info for us, and the nature of the debate is changing. And the news that we receive through these social medias tend to reflect only a narrower group of people who think is important. And we are creating effectively online echo chambers where we may just fail to appreciate against views different from ours. So here's lies a potential problem for leaders, and we will see a world where people will possibly no longer take responsibility to protect vulnerable minority because of the personalization of the internet. So I'm wondering whether you think that the personalization of the internet is eroding the abilities of reconciliation and a mutual understanding among people that is required for the good MSN leadership, rather than clash of MSN dealing with the same issues and new issues.
Are there any other questions or thoughts? Ngaire, Rick, do you want to comment on this, or any closing thoughts?
Maybe, so how are these tools able to make governments or intergovernmental processes more effective? I think this discussion, I hope, has highlighted several ways and also concrete examples. But, you know, Global Fund, Mary brought this up earlier. Just through a quirk of fate, I was the business representative in the transitional working group that Kofi Annan set up to design the Global Fund. However many years ago that thing was. And at the time, this issue, what's going to happen here from the private sector, I and others were saying, you're not going to get companies to write checks. They're not philanthropic organizations by and large. What you could do, though, is to get two things out of the deal. One is substantial in-kind application of equipment, distribution reach on the ground, other kind of in-kind assets, competencies of companies. And the other one is expertise, management expertise or otherwise. And that's what you really want to scale out of the private sector's involvement, as long as you, in addition to conferring an additional degree of legitimacy, not just governmental legitimacy, but within other networks that pay attention to this stuff. And in fact, it was very difficult in many respects, but some of that was captured as the Global Fund evolved forward. But it was never going to be a place where you're going to, the private sector's contribution was not going to be pots of cash by and large, at least on the business side, philanthropic side a little bit. But basically, what does it contribute? New models, by and large. We've discussed some of that. More scale, because resources out there, particularly if you're trying to mobilize capital, and that's the big development issue right now, is there isn't enough ODA out there to fund what we want to do on the climate mitigation and adaptation side, let alone the post-2015 goal process. Most of the capital that's available for financing development is in the private sector in various areas. So the real solution here is, from an optimization standpoint of how you mobilize money for development, is getting a better blended, integrated understanding of how the formal institutions, development institutions, DFIs, are taking risk at the margin and adding institutional capacity that then crowds in the private sector in different ways. And that, using that official money in a targeted surgical way to leverage in much larger multiples of the underlying capital for the fixed investment on infrastructure or public utilities or whatever, that's the right solution. It has to be a public-private solution. And that's a concrete example. It's a new model of development finance, if you will, that can only happen through a GSN style, or what I would call a multi-stakeholder partnership model, if you will. So these are some of the ways. Let me give you one last concrete example as a bit of a segue to this afternoon, climate generally. I think one of the signal mistakes of the UN climate process, and it's not just the UN's fault, it's the government's fault, because the UN is made up of governments, is that we put almost all of our eggs in the basket of coming up with a top-down construct, a multilateral agreement, trying to get into Copenhagen and out. And what was ignored for years, and has been ignored almost up till now, is the need for a set of enabling institutions and incentives and frameworks to happen in areas of the economy that actually have to go through the transformation. And that isn't the product of a foreign minister's or environment minister's discussion, which is what the UN process is. It's basically trying to set a goal and national commitments. Those are important, don't get me wrong, but just setting a global goal and making national promises isn't going to transform energy systems or industrial systems. What really has to happen is get into the areas of economic policy and areas of incentives within different parts of the market on efficiency or technology cooperation, capital flows, and the like, capital allocation decision making. And that's another world, both governmentally and public-private, from the traditional UN norm setting process. The two are we should be walking and chewing gum at the same time, in American idiom here, and the world hasn't done that. For the first time, to his credit, last summer, Ban Ki-moon recognized that, hey, moving into Paris next year, we need to have kind of two tracks, if you will. And the French government, to their credit, has woken way up to this fact. So Laurent Fabius is completely on board with this. And so we and others are now basically trying to work up a strategy of identifying what could be some significant scaled things that could be done in what the French call a positive agenda that would be considered outcomes of COP21, not as the traditional thing with the UN and others, which is sort of side side events, right? Which are basically just kind of dog and pony shows or dialogues, but actually part of what we consider as an international community, the outcomes of the climate process. So you have the official outcome, which hopefully is a new framework, but you also have a set of purpose-built, large-scale collective action undertakings that try to bite off and make progress on some big mitigation and adaptation opportunities. That's how multi-stakeholder partnerships, or GSNs, can improve the effectiveness of intergovernmental arrangements. Again, there are multiple examples of where the world needs to move, and that's why I get a little bit frustrated while I stipulate that the legitimacy questions and transparency questions are on solid ground. The bigger question in my mind is how we really get these two worlds to work much, much better together.
Right, so what would the 2 or 3 pieces of advice to those thinking about the governance of the internet in the future? The first thing is, is there a problem, whose problem, which problem? And here, sort of deficient as our democracies are, they offer perhaps the only way to start trying to weigh those up. If you talk to the British Child Protection Team, they would tell you that internet governance is a disaster because the just appallingly violent escalation of pornography concerning children that they attribute to an extraordinary change in what they're doing as a child protection unit. They would say, well, actually, it is a problem. It's not being well governed. If you talk to Interpol about drug trafficking, money laundering, illicit transfers, they would say there are real risks that a fairly unregulated internet governance is now beginning to pose. Then you've got the concerns, as Don said, of the Russian government, the Chinese government. In other words, everybody's got a view of whether there is a problem or there isn't, right? What should liberty mean in the 21st century? How much privacy should you have on the information that you share on the net? How much commercial liberty should there be? Which pose real questions about who therefore is governing the internet and whose interests are they actually representing. There's always a temptation to say, well, what's the perfect governance model, and then what organization could we have to sell it to other countries? And what we tend to see in global governance is that you just get what we call regulatory forbearance. Countries sign up to it, but don't do it. So they say, okay, if you're going to force us because you're big, powerful countries, we'll sign up. But actually, frankly, we'll just then ignore whether it's actually being enforced or not. Which does point to the need, if you're going to think about a different governance model for the internet, of actually what the options are for countries that are important to it in terms of exit. Can they just exit and go on doing what they do regardless? And does that have implications for the regime as a whole? Because if it does, you actually have to sit down and listen and bring them along and get real ownership and buy-in from them into the process. My observation, particularly with China and Russia, is that when it comes to anything that is rule-binding or constraining, they will only operate through formalized international organizational structures because they think that in the looser networks and the more informal governance structures, they are at a disadvantage, which is why my punt is that if it's going to be a challenge from those two countries, it will end up having to be in an intergovernmental forum. On the so-called dark side scenario of GSN, so my intent today was not to say that global solutions networks are bad at all. It was rather to respond to questions that Don sent me, which was, what's wrong with Bretton Woods? Why do we need GSN? And thinking, well, hold on, that's not the segue, right? There are things wrong with international organizations. We absolutely have to fix those. And we need global solutions networks as well. That said, I think my bottom line would be about the dark side of GSNs, as it were, is how important it is to keep eyes on two things. On the accounts. So Grow Africa, I'm sure, is going to publish exactly what it's doing, who is funding it, what it's doing in country. That's crucial. And on results, which I think has been widely said, on whether whichever organisation we're talking about is actually delivering results or not. Oh, and then there was the question about the personalisation of identity on the internet, which is a really interesting kind of observation about what that means for any kind of collective enterprise, whether it's a transnational social movement or a government. But I think it's a deep philosophical question that we probably can't fully answer today.
Lots of good discussion. I'm delighted that we had a debate, because I find that when everybody agrees, often there's not a lot of learning that occurs, and you do get a synergy where the whole does tend to be bigger than the sum of the parts. Just a couple of comments. On the internet governance issues, you know, we've spent a lot of time studying this, wondering how these models might be applied to governing other resources on the planet. And it is a distributed, meritocratic, multi-stakeholder hodgepodge that's quite extraordinary. And there is no controlling body, and it's worked so far because the topics have been relatively easy. It's basically standards that enable the internet to run and to operate. But now, as Ngaire's pointing out, there are all these other big issues that the global community is facing that has to do with the internet as it becomes part of the fabric of everything. So that ecosystem is now having to tackle a bunch of tougher issues. And they range from pornography to intellectual property, the neutrality of the net, privacy is a huge one. There are all kinds of tough issues. And, you know, sort of ironically, I think that ecosystem may evolve more towards, in part, an advocacy role as they advocate for governments to start to change their behavior. I think it's going to be a tough period. But I think that it would be a big mistake to let the UN get control of the internet, because you might just have a majority of countries in the UN pass a law that's not subject to a Security Council veto that around liability, around slander or something like that.
They can't pass a law.
Well, that, or at least to pass some kind of guidelines or something. You know, around some issues that there isn't real agreement in the world. I mean, one person's pornography is another person's, you know, short dress. So as we get into these tough cultural issues, it's going to be more about changing the attitudes of people around the world towards important issues that are raised by the internet, as opposed to actually, legislating. Just a couple more points. Ngaire, you should have been there yesterday when I did a spirited defense of government and of our international institutions, starting with Ronald Reagan and Thatcher, and how this attack on government, going right up to people like Rob Ford in Toronto today. I mean, it's not just that he's a drug-addicted, lying, hateful, misogynist, racist, drug dealer.
What do you really think?
He calls me a taxpayer. And I find that offensive, because if I'm a taxpayer, the only thing that a government do is can get smaller, right? I pay taxes, so if I pay fewer taxes, that means it's a better government. And he is a single program campaign about making government smaller. This, for your CEOs at Davos, to me is dangerous, because more than ever we need interdependence. And it's also foolish, because business can't succeed in a world that's failing. And we're moving into a period of history that I think is going to be very, very challenging. My little Davos moment, briefly, you mentioned yours, was I was on a panel on citizen engagement. And I was arguing there is a crisis of legitimacy. More and more young people agree with the bumper sticker, don't vote, it only encourages them. And we need to move to a second era of democracy. The first era, we created representative institutions, which we need, but there was a weak public mandate and a culture of what was really citizens were inert. And if we could move to a second model, not direct democracy, but where we have a culture of active citizenship and a public deliberation and so on, So I get stopped by somebody on the panels from a group called Avaz. Young guy created a network with 34 million people. And he says, hold it, Don, I don't get your point. Why is it a problem if all around the world a new generation of young people think that our fossilized institutions of democracy are bankrupt? And I was like speechless, because he's wrong, of course. It is a huge problem, but to me, there is a dark side in all of this. And it's not that these networks will somehow go in the wrong direction, although they're absolutely real dangers. I mean, Al-Qaeda is a multi-stakeholder network that's trying to solve a problem that it perceives to be a problem. But more that we are that if governments and global institutions stay the way that they are, and they don't embrace some kind of partnership multi-stakeholder model, I think that they will become less effective, and this legitimacy crisis will grow. There were a whole bunch of great things. Some of them that came up, some of them we're working on, some of them I think we should. We've done a thing on legitimacy already that sort of, it went a little beyond what Rick was talking about, to sort of give some network leaders some ideas on how they can become legitimate. But the idea of a decision-making representation, the whole burst issue is a good one. Sometimes you don't want a network to last. You want it to be a pop-up network and just do its role. And then, but under what conditions should they be built to last? We're doing a lot of work on how GSN should work with traditional institutions. And the Bruce Jenks is just one of them. I think we need to look at this issue of state power more, and when and under what circumstances do you really need state power to intervene to solve a problem? I mean, we're going to have a big talk about multi-stakeholder networks and climate this afternoon, but ultimately you need some laws that have to do with carbon. So what's the sort of dynamic there? And then the whole issue of multidimensional cooperation, that was a pretty enticing little gem that you threw out there, Rick, but I'd like to pursue that one further. So the discussion continues. If that generated some insights for you about more work that we should be doing.
Can I make a 10-second
Yes.
footnote?
Please do.
On the internet,
yeah.
just 10, 15 seconds.
Yeah.
Yesterday, the ICANN held the largest meeting it's ever held. ICANN, the Internet Technical Body, which is a multi-stakeholder quasi-international organization, if you will. At that meeting, the Chinese Minister for the Internet articulated publicly that China would support a multi-stakeholder governance approach.
Wow.
There we go.
Just,
Yeah, and
in other words, endorse the Net Mundial process.
that's great.
It's quite interesting.
The 10 seconds I just wanted to add was, I mentioned those CEOs at Davos disdaining government, but I don't want to end without saying that when I said to them, well, how effective, and said, well, what would each of you do to improve the prospects of better government, since you clearly believe that government needs to be better? They had some great ideas. They had, and a couple of them didn't have ideas there, but wrote afterwards. So they had great ideas, which actually underscores what each of Rick and Don are doing in building multi-stakeholder networks. It really does underscore their incredible strength in providing ideas, in forging solutions, and in forging communities of people willing to take forward solutions.
I will not give a 10-second follow-on. So could we have a round of applause for the panel?